Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today to talk about the protests in Iran is Abdolrasool Divsallar. He's known as Farzam to those of us who are lucky enough to call him a friend. Farzam and I met in Italy many years ago at a geopolitics conference for Limes to be specific. And we got to catch up. He was actually one of the first guests on this podcast when it originally launched, but we haven't had him on in well over a year. So we thought it time to bring him back. We are recording this podcast on Tuesday, October 4th. We're going to hustle to get this out as quickly as we can, but it may be sort of Monday at the latest. So there may be some things that change in the interim, but I think this is still a really great overview of what's happening in Iran and why these protests are so important and so eyebrow-raising. Otherwise, just want to give a shout-out to my beautiful young daughter, Annie Love, 6 weeks old, who last night did not sleep at all, so neither did I. So this podcast is brought to you by copious amounts of coffee. Anyway, enough jokes. Thank you so much, Farzam, for tackling this important subject with us. There'll be more Iran coverage as we go forward here. I'll try to get Kamran back on the show soon as well. But other than that, cheers, as always. Leave us a rating or a review. You can write to us or write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments, and I will see you out there. Cognitive Investments, LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Farzam, you were one of the first guests on this podcast, and so it's been too long. It's really nice to welcome you back, and I wish we had a happier topic to dive into to discuss today.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Thanks again for having me.
Let's get right down to brass tacks. Obviously, the protests that are happening in Iran are front of most people's minds when it comes to geopolitics. I always struggle a little bit with trying to understand what's going on inside Iran because there's so many, it seems to me, Iranian expatriates who have strong views about what's going on in Iran, and there's a media ecosystem that seems to criticize Iran every time something happens, and yet at the same time, this is now weeks of protests going on. It's hard to deny the videos. It seems like the Iranian regime is feeling pretty stressed as well. So it seems pretty clear that something is happening, but I guess my question to you is, we've had unrest in Iran before. I can remember it in 2019. I can remember it earlier in the 2010s. Is the unrest here different? Is there something different about what's happening in Iran today compared to previous bouts of unrest that will challenge the regime's stability? Or is this just part of what it is to be in Iran?
Well, that's a very good question to start. I totally agree with you that there is something taking place in Tehran these days, something quite obviously sad and I think severe. But there are differences from what previous protests have been. While I can say that Islamic Republic, from the very beginning had this problem of representation. It means that it was not completely representing Iranian society. I should say that now this crisis of representation has deepened. So the circle of the people or the part of the population that the state represents and tries to address their demands and requests has shrinked a lot. It's just a very few minority that the state tries to respond to their demands and try to appease them. So that's the core of the problem, I think, with this current protest. Let me just make it more clear. Everything goes back to last year's presidential election that the turnout was 48%, just the lowest turnout in Islamic Republic's 4 decades of ruling Iran. And the reason was this conclusion of the elites and the leadership that the state should be unified, basically unified around a core group of elites who are ultra conservatives from ultra conservative camps. they basically set the scene in a way that it's prevented any other alternative political group like reformists, like moderates, to come up in the election. And Ibrahim Raisi become a president while everything was prepared for him to be the president. So he was not actually elected; he was selected, and the election was somehow a kind of engineering process to give him this opportunity. But this fact was quite important because, while previously the election in Iran at least was providing a kind of a political space to create a sort of, let's say, political discussion among various groups, various parts of the society, but at the same time, various political groups with different ideas that had different approach toward reform, toward the future of Iran and its policies. So this time round, the state has completely become unified around this group of ultra conservatives, and they have found the chance to go ahead with parts of their policies, which for a long time they were discussing some sort of social policies that represents again that very minority mindset. What we've seen actually, what we have seen in the last 1 year of the Raisi's administration was a kind of let's say, social engineering plan that the idea was bringing back the society, bringing back the society to the principles of revolution. So sort of Islamization of the society, while the majority of Iranian normal people have actually complete different perspectives. So the state found the chance by this being a unified, state. It found the chance to go ahead with some sort of social policy, social engineering process that very much limited normal life in Iran, limited social space in Iran. So the restrictions over various areas of social life increased. So the Raisi administration started to, for example, to come up with two major plans, which I think were quite controversial. First was the national internet plan, which basically the idea was creating a kind of national internet and cut off Iran from the global internet. This basically created more restrictions on Iran's access to the global net. But at the same time, actually the idea of bringing back hijab, or this Islamic dress code, at the forefront of this social policy. So those actions, continued with a very bold and aggressive sort of implementation. There were sort of hijab patrols in the streets of Tehran and around the country, which the aim was controlling how people are wearing hijab and how the dress code is respected or not respected. So what I am saying is that this was something quite new, from the sense that while previously the previous protests were very much taken in a space that, for example, when you look to 2009, the Green Movement, there was a sort of hope. There was a kind of dialogue and dialectic between two group of political camps, two group like reformists and conservatives, that they had a sort of discussion about the future of Iran. But this time around, actually, this unification and this complete power state to go ahead with whatever it thinks that society should do has basically cut off the state-society relationship. So what I'm saying is that there is a huge growing state-society divide these days inside Iran. The government is not representing majority of the society, and the society believes that by this closure of political space, there is no hope for reform or for changing the situation. That's why they choose coming to the public space, to the street, to protest and to forcefully at least try to change the situation. This is completely different because it is telling us a kind of a new perception of the closure of the hope. There is no hope now for reforming of Islamic Republic. There is no hope among society that, look, we can probably through a political way change the how state is adopting policies, because basically the state has closed the political space, any political participation of the normal majority Iranians into its decision making cycles. I'm not arguing that, for example, in 2009 the political participation was perfect, or it was a very good situation there. Of course, at that time, even the Ahmadinejad second round was faced with this sort of suppression of reformist and Musavi, but at the same time, still there were hope for future. Rouhani administration comes up with this slogan of hope. So Raisi administration is in a completely different situation.
Yeah. You're painting a pretty grim picture. Where is the supreme leader in this? So, I mean, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, I feel like there's been speculation about his health also for years, if not decades. It seems like he's always right on death's door, at least as it's reported in Western media. But then he always comes back and reappears. Those whispers have gotten louder in the last couple of weeks. If you read, Wall Street Journal and Reuters and things like that, it's Khamenei hasn't been at the strategy meetings and he hasn't been able to do anything, and maybe he's anointing his son as a potential successor. We're recording here on Tuesday, October 4th. It looks like he came out today and made some kind of statement talking about how, the situation was very sad about the woman who died, but these protests were planned and it's a conspiracy and this, that, the other thing. Do you have any insight into whether the supreme leader has health issues that are affecting his performance, and how is it that that this move towards social engineering, as you called it, happened under his watch? Is that a reflection of him getting weaker and some of these elements within the Iranian state seeing an opportunity and pushing forward? Is the supreme leader behind this push towards social engineering? Help us understand where he's at in all of this.
Well, that's a good question. Well, I think that's there are credible reports that he has some health issues, but obviously what we know is that he's alive still. So, but what is more important, I think, is the broader approach and a broader perspective of those people who are close to him in the circle of power inside his office. Yes, I mean the ideas of social engineering was something that were discussed for a long time among conservative camps, especially inside the office of the leader. They established a center for study of Iranian Islamic model of progress, and a number of other centers in holy city of Qom, for example. For years, they were working on various social engineering plans on how to Islamization, they can proceed with this Islamization plan, how they can bring back society to the principles of revolution and Islam. And now with the Raisi government, this is. But the point is that I think more strategically, what the leadership has learned from the history from history of revolutions, from history of regime change across the world, is two important lessons. I think Iranian leaderships, they have studied quite well Perestroika and Glasnost. They are so sensitive about any sort of reform, any
Mm.
sort of political or economic reform in their perspective, could easily be linked to change of the political system. So their lesson from the collapse of the Soviet Union was that if you start the process of reform, then gradually and phase by phase you enter to the next stages of the reform, either it's economic or political, and then after a while, basically you are transforming the revolution, and that's something they don't want to go through. And the second lesson, which is equally important, and I think they have thought a lot about it, is the fact that they strongly believe that using of a force uh, is critical to stop, let's say, social demands and protests like this. And that is going back to the experience of Shah during the last years of 1979 revolution, in which Shah was quite reluctant to use force. So he didn't use force against the revolutionaries in the street at that time. And what the Islamic Republic leadership is understanding is that if they go over if they do the same policy, they will face with the challenge of the regime change. So what I'm saying is this broader approach. The supreme leader is part of that, but whole, let's say, deep state inside Iran, the leadership, the circle of leadership, which is very much functioning based on a sort of a kind of fragile consensus, I can say. A decision making is taking place based on a sort of consensus. It's not a full consensus, but it's a kind of an agreement on principles, on the frameworks. And these are the principles that they believe. So to put it in a different way, they think that no matter you're facing with an external adversary, like, for example, United States for the nuclear file, or you're facing with the normal people in the streets of Tehran, you need to increase the cost of opposition to a level that those people who are opposing you conclude that, okay, so there's no more interest to go ahead with this path, and let's change our policy. So basically, they try to increase the cost to their opponents by raising the threat. So they are very much, you can see it even in nuclear fight. They are ready to ascend the ladder of escalation. And now you're seeing it in the street of Tehran. So they go and they start killing people in a very obvious way. Uh, Mass imprisonment of the people, just to incite fear and increase the cost of protest to a level that the normal people conclude that, okay, it's enough. We cannot accept this number of killings and this level of destruction for the country. So I don't see whether the leader is there or not. This mentality or this approach to statehood easily changes among Islamic Republic leadership. So they reject the prospects of change because of that, as I said, that prospects of revision of the policies might later in the next stage end up into a kind of a full transformation of the revolution, and that's probably where the regime will change. So unfortunately, what I see for a future, whether the leader is there or not, is the continuation of this process and a more violent crackdown of the people, or what I call it a maximum suppression.
Well, but that sword cuts both ways, because it's one thing to make it clear to the opposition that there's no hope and that they shouldn't resist and to increase the cost. But when you increase the cost too much and kill hope entirely, then the opposition has nothing to lose. They have no dignity to lose. They have no pride to lose. Their sons and daughters are dying in the streets. And then you actually have the sort of foment that creates the exact sort of revolution that you're saying that the establishment wants to avoid. So, I mean, do you think that's where we're headed, or do you think that the establishment has such a monopoly on force that it will crack down and will sort of go back to a more conservative, a more tightly controlled status quo?
Well, I think that's the last point that you mentioned. There is a huge concentration of force and monopoly of the tools of violence in Iran. So I think the loyalty of the armed forces and those deep states to the revolution is still very high, and that's where they have invested throughout these 4 decades hugely. So there is a huge interest for the deep state, and what I mean by deep state is RGC, Revolutionary Guard, the Ministry of Intelligence, the Artesh even itself, and all these security apparatus, that their interest, I mean, their personal interest and their institutional interest in the continuation of the current status quo, and they have an absolute monopoly over the tools of violence. So I think they are quite confident about the fact that their suppression capacity is higher than what people can bring to the street. And you need to remember that we're talking about roughly 20-25% of the population that are supporting the regime because of various reasons. Their interest, they're part of that power circle. So if anything changes, they lose their power status, and so on. Their economic interest, and also some less for the religious matters. They really believe that this revolution is a kind of a divine state, so they need to preserve it. Of course, that percentage I think, is lower than other parts, but still, you have something about 20-25% that usually that's security apparatus and deep state are part of, are included into that 20-25%. So a kind of complex situation, because at the same time, what you are saying is right. The too much of killing can, exacerbate the situation. But I think the understanding of Iranian leadership is that they have more superior suppression capacity than what society can bring to the street at this moment.
Where are political figures like Rouhani right now? Are they part of this establishment and they just have a different perspective, but they go along with this and are part of the 25%? Or is or is part of the political class in a sense being purged? Should we expect to see Rouhani thrown in a jail at some point? I mean, I'm exaggerating for effect there,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. I don't think so. They're all part of this political establishment that, in one way or another, they're benefiting from the status quo. I don't think that Rouhani is very much. He has been silent in the last 2-3 weeks. I don't expect that they come up with some sort of a complete opposition to the leader's policy or the security apparatus policy. So, and basically also people on the street, they're not asking for any sort of leadership that is coming out from from the current political establishment. This is different from the 2009, that you had one candidate who was part of the election, and he lost the election, so he brought his supporters to the street. This time around is different. You don't have a kind of a leadership, or there's no established political figure who is emerged as a kind of a leader. It's a more social and very much actually leaderless process that is socially driven. It's again back to the point that I was saying. It's a show of the hopelessness of the people to the current political elites and political climate and institutions inside Iran.
well, Farzam, you're not doing a very good job at cheering me up so far. That's all very depressing. Let's let's zoom out a little bit and try and figure out some implications of this, or think about Iran as a global actor and not just what's going on internally. I thought the Iran nuclear deal was going to be revived. I'd been saying that since the beginning of the year.
Before that,
Yeah,
can I just add one point?
yeah,
Uh,
please.
yeah, just I think there is one regional dimension to this too, and that is the fact that how regional actors, like for example Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and other GCC countries, reacting to that situation in Iran. I think what we are seeing so far is that the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf are also authoritarian systems. They also have many similar sort of problems with what we see in Iran. So they are not coming up to support normal Iranians or making a very harsh criticism of the Iranian establishment, or supporting a sort of this type of revolution, because this is a fear that this might be a kind of let's say spread it throughout the region, and somehow in future creates more problems for them internally. So you don't have any regional external pressure on Islamic Republic to change its course. At the same time, when you look to the US policies or European policies, again, the great power politics here is also playing a role in a not constructive way, because US and Europe are not really acting as a powers or as external actors that can contribute to the change that the Iranians are looking after. There is a nuclear deal that is the discussion is taking place these days, and I think U.S. is very much more concerned about the nuclear deal rather than the regime change in Iran, or supporting the freedom movements inside Iran. So in this very complex international relation surrounding the protests, what I'm saying is that Islamic Republic have found a very good opportunity to suppress as much as it can. There's no major external pressure or external factor that can limit what the state is doing inside with its own people.
I guess so. I think you're underselling the. I mean, the United States has been trying to foment regime change in Iran for literally years, and it's been failing at it. But it doesn't seem to be able to push it that far forward. But I take your point that there are not many things that external actors can do to help the situation in Iran. The Iranian people have to rise up and take those things for themselves. But this also gets back to it's becoming a little bit more clear to me why Iran feels cozier with Russia and with China, because those are authoritarian regimes and they at least speak the same language and there are some common causes there. I hadn't thought to ask you this, but is Russia's overwhelming lack of success in Ukraine going to shake this Iranian regime's faith in Russia as a partner going forward, or even sort of cause it to look within itself a little bit more deeply? Because I think we're looking at a Russian regime that is jeopardizing itself by overstepping and by, to your point, making decisions that don't reflect a majority of what the Russian population wants. Is there some Ukraine hangover or after effect on what's happening in Iran from that point of view?
Well, that's a very big question, actually. Iran-Russia relation been so much under spot these days. I think there are two factors quite important here. First is that both countries, both Moscow and Tehran, are facing similar problems. They're under international isolation and international sanctions, severe international sanctions. They have, somehow a similar level of isolation. Then both have problems at home. It's interesting to note that these protests in Iran took place somehow at the same period that many protests took place in Russia after the announcement of the mobilization by Putin, and many people were arrested. There was a complete social mess in Russia over the mobilization. So you have two states having problems at home. And these two factors, I mean, problems outside, isolation internationally, and internal problems, has brought actually Russia and Iran very much close. They are increasingly finding themselves in a similar situation that needs cooperation to overcome their common problems. And there are a number of areas of cooperation they're doing. Part of it simply goes back to economic and trade, which actually relates to this sanctions and isolations that both face. They're now cooperating on, for example, linking their financial systems together, easing trade, or doing some new agreements about tourism, Russian tourism in Iran, and many other agreements that they have signed many years ago, but remained, just on the table and never been implemented. Now they're coming back to those agreements to start implementing them. So, there are a number of areas of cooperation taking place on economic side, but also Moscow and Tehran are very much, politically support each other. For example, if you look in whatever Iranian policy in the Middle East, like Iran's missile program, or like Iran's regional policies, Russia never criticized Iran. That's a kind of a political endorsement of what is Iran policy in the region. So Iran never feels threatened by Russia's criticism over its key areas of contestation with U.S. But they have common projects, like, again, in Middle East, in Syria, they're working together. There's a complete interdependency in Syria between Russia and Iran, in the sense that both strategically follow a common goal, and that is keeping the Assad secure and keeping him in place. And they're cooperating in a very burden sharing manner. Means now that Russians have some problems in providing force to Syria, Iranians are taking some spaces and trying to increase their presence in order to somehow resolve that problem of resource deficit on the Russian side. So there's a sort of kind of collaboration taking place on that dimension too. But interestingly, again, despite all these sort of complex relations between the Moscow and Tehran, the core of why they are getting closer to each other is this sort of strategic sympathy that they have. You know, the leadership in both countries, they see the world somehow equally. They see the West as power that is trying to threaten them, that is trying to change their political establishment, that is trying to threaten them in various ways, culturally, or economically, or militarily. So this has created a sort of strategic, sympathy. But one point when it comes to Russia-Iran relation is quite important, I think, Jacob, and that is the fact that they have limitations in how much they can go ahead with their sort of cooperation. They cannot transform their relation to a sort of alliance like Europe and US, what we see, for example, because there are certain limits. And on top of that, there are major mistrust between Iranians and Russian. There is the fear of imperial, let's say, objectives from Iranian side toward Russia. So Iranians have this historical fear toward Russia, that Russia is an occupying power. We should not forget that the last part of Iranian territory, major part of Iranian territory that was taken from Iran was taken by Russians. So Iran lost land to Russia. That has not gone away from Iranian mindset. And at the same time, they have very few shared values. Again, it's not like Europe. It's not like a liberalism that you have some, shared values. There is one Christian country, dominated Christian country, which is Russia, and then there is one Muslim Shiite country. So there are very few values in terms of how society are looking at each other. And if you go deeper to the Iranian Russian society, you see that there's very few people to people connection. While if you look at, for example, Iran and EU, or Europe in general, you see how huge this people to people connection between Iran and Europe is. That's why these are all the things that I think has made Iran-Russia relations a sort of transactional partnership that helps them to overcome the urgencies that they face at some certain situation. Now they're both in crisis. Iran in protest, Russia in uh, internal domestic crisis, at the same time having a war. So this condition, I think has brought them to this conclusion that they should cooperate. I call it a kind of authoritarian alliance.
Yeah. Well, turning back to the Iran nuclear deal, because I feel like the Iran nuclear deal was the European/American attempt to attract Iran away from Russia and from the access of authoritarians, if you will. And as I alluded to earlier, I really thought the Iran nuclear deal was going to happen earlier this year. It seemed to me that it was in the U.S. and European interest. We're seeing that with high energy prices right now, and Iran is, potential energy superpower, especially if it can get some Western technology in there. And then for Iran, I mean, for years, as you mentioned, it's been an international pariah. Its markets have been isolated. The economic situation has been bad. Previous protests have been around high food prices, high commodity prices, all those other sorts of things. But instead, no. And I feel like the answer you're going to give me is that the Iranian regime thinks that prosperity will also threaten its position, and that it doesn't want people to enjoy wealth and prosperity because that challenges their conservative authoritarian bent or whatever else. But did I just misjudge Iran's interests there? I mean, it seems clear as day to me that Iran's geopolitical interest is not to become a Middle Eastern version of North Korea. But for some reason, it looks like Iran is making that choice, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me at first blush.
Well, right, but let me clarify one point. I think still JCPOA revival project has not failed. I mean, at least completely. Well, I have some reasons for that. First of all, I think all sides escape from, you see it very clearly in how Americans and Iranians and even Europeans are, talking in public and giving report of the status of the revival. All sides are somehow escaping from a scenario which they announced the failure of the JCPOA. No one has announced that failure, so they try to underpin the fact that the revival process is still going on and it's still not finished. Well, the reason is because of its, I mean, the failure of a JCPOA, I think both for US and Iran will have some huge political and security risks. Because there's no, credible alternative with a guaranteed result if the JCPOA fails. For US, especially, keeping the JCPOA in the current format, which is, of course, I agree, it's a kind of a non-functional format. It's not a JCPOA that we were imagining from the very beginning that could completely stop Iranian nuclear activity, but still, the current format benefits US from the sense that can have some sort of monitoring and some sort of possibility to at least revive the monitoring process over Iran's nuclear activity. And also, I think the US side is somehow, according to what at least we know from the intelligence community's report, which was released a few months ago, the fact that Iran does not have this intention to go nuclear. So this makes US policymakers somehow, relax that at least in a very short time we don't have this risk. But at the same time, US is keeping its maximum pressure. So that's also the fact that it's trying to keep its leverage. So on the Iranian side, why Iranians do not want to get out of the JCPOA, announce it to be failed completely? Because basically the answer is very simple, because they don't have any next stage after the failure of the JCPOA. They already did whatever they could have done. They already enriched as much uranium as they wanted, so they are already a kind of a breakout. They are in the state of a breakout moment, so they can decide to go for a first nuclear bomb whenever they want. They have enough material for that.
Hmm.
So, what is the next stage if they get out of the JCPOA, and how they can benefit from that? And while I believe strongly that the Iranians do not have this strategic intent to go for a nuclear bomb. They don't see the necessity of that at this moment. They are quite confident with their conventional military capability, so that they don't basically see the security needs of going toward the nuclear bomb. And these are the reasons that I think explains why also Iran do not prefer to announce the death of the process of the revival of the JCPOA. So we're in a situation that both US and Iran somehow are following a kind of a strategy of a slow revival process, a delaying of this process. They see it's still better than announcing it a failed process. So I am, but at the same time, I'm a bit hopeful these days that the protest somehow, you know, might push Iranian government to soften some of its positions regarding the deal. And the reason is that, the 1 year into Raisi government, it was failure on all sides of its policies. So he basically failed to, in any sense, to improve normal Iranians' economic situation. The economic stagnation continued, recession continued. So basically, no improvement. More Iranians are becoming are going under the poverty line, and his resistance economic concept was not really successful. On international level, he was actually uh, almost done no major activity. The JCPOA was not going ahead, and the Iran being a member of the SCO Shanghai Cooperation Organization was a project that was actually pushed forward by the previous administration of President Rouhani. So, uh, you know, again, looking at Raisi, even his social policy, as I was explaining, um, was a sort of failure. It resulted to this new rounds of protests. So Raisi needs something at this moment, needs a kind of a success story, needs some sort of achievement. And that makes me a bit hopeful that maybe his administration at some point conclude that they should speed up the process of JCPO revival. And we're hearing, for example, the last 2 3 days, somehow a kind of a movement on the JCPO file by the travel of Iran's head of nuclear organization to Vienna to talk with the IEA chief. DJ, and that's somehow shows that Iran has some tendency to resolve the IAEA safeguard issues, which is now one of the reasons that the deal is not revoked. So all in all, I think we cannot still say that the deal will die or it's dead. There are hopes, but one scenario which could be also an important, there are reasons that might take place, is the fact that both the US and Iran decide to remain in the current situation. So a kind of a long process of revival that may take another 1 year or even another 2 year. But both sides know at this format that they're not going to, let's say, escalate the situation more than this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've been watching the Iranian officials shuttle back and forth from Vienna so much, and every time there's some hope and it's not going to be there. And I think in some ways the more important thing you said was that the breakout capacity is already there. One of the questions I've been getting, I wonder if you've been getting this question too, in your neck of the woods, is everybody's asking if Russia is considering use of a quote unquote tactical nuclear weapon in the Russia-Ukraine war. I confess, and I've said on this podcast before, I still have no idea what a tactical nuclear weapon is. It seems to me that a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, and I don't understand the sort of false clarification about, if it's a little bit smaller, so it doesn't count as the main one. But the question I wanted to ask was on, I think, the still low but increasing probability that Russia were to use such a weapon in Ukraine. How would Iran react towards that? Would Iran criticize Russia? Would Iran sort of be quiet about it? Would it have any effect on how Iran thinks about nuclear weapons? You said that they're confident in their conventional defenses or their conventional military forces. If Russia used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, would Iran look at itself in the mirror and say, we're going to need nuclear weapons then, because if the Russians are going to do this, we need to make sure that we're prepared. Maybe others will want to use these weapons. Talk to me about the sort of malleability of Iran nuclear doctrine in that context.
Well, that's a very important question. Actually, one of the first impacts of the war in Ukraine on how Iranians started to look at deterrence was the fact that many in Tehran started to debate about the rationale behind nuclear bomb. So the idea that Ukraine was attacked uh, because of the fact that it didn't have proper uh, deterrence capacity, which basically we're talking about nuclear weapon here. So I think that debate very much popped up after the war in Ukraine, and it was the first impact. But this was very much on the surface of this more social debate rather than taking place in a more circles of power or security circles inside Iran. So this has a reason. And the reason is that Iranians decide to go for a nuclear weapon, and their actually nuclear project started in a time that Iran had a serious conventional problems. Iran's military capacity during the 90s, which the nuclear program started to become militarized, wasn't the lowest. Iran has just got out from the Iran-Iraq war, 8 years of the war, so there was no actual modernization plan. Iran has bought few items from Russia. There were some submarines, kilo version of submarines that Iran bought from Russia. There were some MiG 29s that Iran bought. But all these, let's say, new armaments and new arms were not the type that the Iranian army would say, okay, so these are properly enough for responding to our security needs. So there was a kind of understanding in Tehran that their conventional deterrence is very much behind what they need. And remember, because this is quite important when we talk about Iran's nuclear program, this decision to go to become nuclear was taken at a time that U.S. conducted the 1991 Desert Storm operation. This was a massive military operation that was a kind of a revolution in military affair. Basically, U.S. conducted a completely new type of warfare that very much surprised all the outsiders who were studying and looking at the wars, including Iranians. So they started to realize that they are not really capable of withstanding any possible U.S. strike to their country. So the combination of increasing the nature of the threat, the lack of perception of having a sufficient deterrence, all these related to the decision of Iranian leadership at that time to go to nuclear. So I don't see these factors to be present at this moment because of several reasons. First, I think Iranians have a very good confidence in their deterrence capacity because of several reasons. Their strategy was very much based on containing a U.S. Power projection or U.S. power in various domains. So, for example, while you see that U.S. operation in Iraq was very much a kind of a mix of was not really involved on the sea warfare. U.S. was quite able to maintain its sea superiority without any problem. So Iranians have worked a lot on containing or limiting U.S. sea superiority, and that's where you see a lot of contacts between Iranian Navy and the U.S. Navy, CENTCOM in that part. So a kind of a hybrid warfare that Iran attempts to engage with U.S. in the sea, in the air, through the very complex air defense system that Iran has created throughout the last 2 decades, through creating a powerful long standoff capability means creating offensive power through using missiles and complexes with drones, a mixture of drones and missile strikes. So, all the mixture of offensive conventional capability, which is comprised of missiles and drones and long range artillery systems, plus the area access, area denial A2AD means area denial anti-access capability, which basically prevents U.S. from project power in a close areas around Iran. So what I'm trying to say is that Iranians were quite successful in coming up with a sort of military doctrine that guarantees them the possibility of a sort of acceptable defense from their territories, or at least sending this signal to the US that if the Americans want to enter to Iran, they are going to have a very long and costly war. And that's not something that US is going to accept. So this is what I was explaining at the beginning of our discussion, that Iran attempts to create this deterrence by increasing the cost or raising the cost of opposing its policies. So in this situation, there is no major security needs by Iranians now at this moment to go nuclear. At the same time, they see, and this is my last point, and then I come back to you, they see more harm and more costs on the regional side if they go for a nuclear bomb. What I mean is that they realize that they have realized quite well that there is a risk that Turkey and Saudi Arabia will move toward a nuclear bomb if Iran decides to become nuclear. And then they need to engage in a sort of a nuclear race in the region with Turkey and with Saudi Arabia, which obviously their resources and their access to international technology and international military assets or arms and export capacities is much higher than Iran. So, in a long term perspective, the costs of Iran becoming a nuclear capable country is somehow high for Iranians, while with their current conventional deterrence, they have a good sense that they can keep to continue defending Iran for the next decade. That's why this discussion of the war in Ukraine, how it impacted Iran's understanding of nuclear deterrence, was very much created a sort of a debate on the social level, not very much deep into how Iranian strategists were thinking. But what it what it actually reinforced was the concept of deterrence in general. What I believe is that the war in Ukraine very much pushed Iranian toward the direction that they will not never accept any kind of arms reduction or arms control, let's say, discussion with the US or with other regional actors because of the fears of the negative impact that it might have on their deterrence capabilities.
Well, you anticipated my last question perfectly, which was the last time we spoke on this podcast. I had asked you if Iran and Turkey were set to sort of duel for regional influence for a generation, and you told me, no, Jacob, that's a stupid Western way of looking at things. Iran and Turkey are relatively on the same page, and they deal with each other pragmatically. Is that still the case? Because it still seems to me like Erdogan is pushing Turkey as the leader of the Sunni Muslim world. He's certainly at cross purposes with the Assad regime in Syria. He is certainly building military capabilities in North Africa and the Horn of Africa that I would think make Iran nervous. Are you still feeling relatively optimistic about Iranian Turkish ties, that there's a space for them to cooperate? Or do you think we actually are moving towards a more competitive landscape, not necessarily because of Iran, but because Turkey really seems to be more ambitious and is pushing out more muscularly in the region and affecting Iranian interests in that way?
Well, you're right. I think you're somehow right. I need to maybe revise a bit my view of previous point that I raised, but not 100%. I am somewhere in between. Based on the current developments, I think there is, of course, obviously, there is a growing area of competition between Iran and Turkey. Looking at Caucasus and how the dimension of Nagorno-Karabakh war in Azerbaijan and Armenia took place, very much clearly shows that how Turkey and Iran are standing on two different sides. So it's very interesting that Iran is very much allied with U.S. At this war rather than Turkey. So somehow there is a kind of unwritten shared interest between Iran and U.S. over how they see the future of Armenia. They're both supporting Armenia's independence and integral territory integrity because of of course, various reasons, but in any sense, their objective is the same. While Turkey and Azerbaijan and somehow Israel, they are on the opposite side. They are actually viewing the possibility of creating this, corridor, Zangdor corridor, which is somehow giving this possibility to Turkey to extend its influence and power and cut Iran geopolitically from reaching to Russia by land and to Black Sea by land. So, this is a very obvious and very hot area of competition between Iran and Turkey. There are reports that Iranian army was actually stationed in the border with Armenia in order to enter to Armenia and help Armenians to defend the territories and probably start to counter offensive against the Azerbaijani force inside Armenia. And there's now this growing diplomatic and possibly even military cooperation between Iran and Armenia, and interestingly between U.S. and Armenia. So, yes, you're right. We see some areas of competition. Another area of competition is obviously in Syria, where there were some conflicts of interest. And in the last trip of Erdogan to Tehran, the Iranian supreme leader put a very clear red line that Turkey should not involve in a kind of offensive operation into the Syrian territories. Otherwise, Iran and Russia will somehow resist such a possibility. So another third one is somehow in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which Iran supports somehow Tajikistan, and Turkey is somehow supporting Kyrgyzstan, where actually Iran started to support Tajikistan some drones, and it built a drone factory in Tajikistan just a few months ago, while Turkey providing its own drones to Kyrgyzstan. So it's what I want to say is that, right, we are seeing areas of competition to grow, but what I always say between Iran and Turkey, which is I think is important, is the fact that despite these competitions, Iran-Turkey relation is very much like seems like Turkey-Russia relations. They have a lot of area of competitions, but at the same time, because of many more interests that they have, and because of very good institutional capacity that they have built throughout the year to communicate, to dialogue, both on political level and on the security and defense side, they are somehow capable to manage their conflict of interest in a way that it doesn't emerge as a sort of a rivalry and a sort of a complete open rivalry like what we see, for example, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I don't expect in any new future we will see a kind of a trend like what we see between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Iran and Turkey. So again, because there is a very established link of communication on the military and the security between both sides, there are certain areas of interest, like a core interest of the Kurdish issue. This is something that both Iran and Turkey, they are on the same page. So they don't want a separate Kurdish region to emerge in the Middle East, and they continuously cooperate and coordinate on that issue, and even they do joint strikes, somehow not a kind of official joint strike, but somehow coordinated on the timing strikes on the Kurdish opposition groups which are in Iraq, for example. So what I'm saying is that that's a very complex relation. This complex relation, um, I agree with you. I expect that we may see more competitions, but at the same time, we should remember that the interests are so huge there. They will probably be able to manage their conflict of interest throughout all the tools and dispute resolution mechanisms that they already have in place between themselves.
Well, on that note, Farzam, let's not let more than a year go by until you come back on the podcast, and I hope you'll allow me to reach out to you if something changes here in the situation in Iran. But otherwise, it's good to see you at least on the video here, and I hope to see you in person sometime soon. So thanks for making the time, and let's hope for better days for the Iranian people. It seems pretty grim to me.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jacob, for having me again and your very interesting podcast. And I hope that we have the American people and American administration support for the Iranian movement for freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.